Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into something pretty interesting.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
We're tackling Doge today.
Okay.
And no, not the meme this time.
Right.
This Doge is a proposed advisory group, the brainchild of Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy,
Wow.
with Donald Trump in their corner
Okay.
and their mission to shake up the U.S. federal government big time.
It's ambitious.
Oh, it is. And to help us understand it all,
Yeah.
we've got Musk and Ramaswamy's own words in that Wall Street Journal piece,
Okay.
plus all the reactions from the media.
Right.
And of course, we can't forget those always entertaining social media posts from the key players themselves.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly is this Doge?
Right. It's not like some new government department, is it?
Not exactly. It's more like a high-powered consulting group, I'd say,
Okay.
reporting directly to the White House.
Interesting.
And get this, they've given themselves a deadline, July 4th, 2026.
Oh, wow. Talk about a dramatic timeline.
Right. You can't miss that symbolism. Aiming to wrap up right on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence.
But this whole idea bringing in outsiders to overhaul the government, that feels familiar somehow.
You're picking up on something there. There are definitely some parallels to the Grace Commission under Reagan back in the 1980s.
Oh, really? Tell me more.
Well, it was another attempt to tackle government spending and all that bureaucracy using that private sector approach.
Interesting. So did it work?
Well, the commission, they produced tons of recommendations, huge report.
Yeah.
But actually implementing them, that was a whole other story. A lot of them just fell by the wayside.
So the big question for Doge then?
Yeah.
Can they succeed where the Grace Commission kind of stumbled?
That's the million-dollar question.
It seems like Musk and Ramaswamy aren't lacking in confidence, though, if their rhetoric is anything to go by.
True that. They labeled the federal bureaucracy an existential threat. Come on. That's some pretty strong language, right?
It is. And Ramaswamy's pronouncements haven't been subtle either, especially that speech at the Mar-a-Lago Gala.
Talk about mass deportations of bureaucrats and wielding a chainsaw. Paints a pretty vivid picture.
It does. It does.
They definitely want to make a splash.
Yeah.
But what does that actually mean, in practical terms? What are they actually aiming to change?
The scope is massive. Musk claims they can find $2 trillion in savings.
$2 trillion.
Yeah, over $2 trillion. That's like a third of the entire federal budget.
Wow. That's a staggering number. Where would those cuts even come from? Are they just talking about, trimming the fat? Or is it something a lot more drastic?
Well, to understand that, we need to look at the federal budget itself.
Right.
Roughly 2/3 of it is mandatory spending.
Like what?
That includes those big programs. Everyone knows them, Social Security, Medicare.
Right.
Those are essentially locked in. They serve so many Americans who depend on them.
Yeah. Makes sense. So those are probably off the table then. Where else could they possibly find such significant savings?
Well, Ramaswamy, he's been specific about some of his targets. He campaigned on shutting down entire agencies.
Really? Like what we're talking Department of Education, the FBI, even the IRS.
Whoa. Imagine if those agencies were actually abolished. That's huge.
It would be a radical shakeup for sure.
I can already hear the uproar coming from both sides of the aisle.
Definitely.
But even if Doge wanted to target these agencies, could they actually pull it off?
Well, that's where the skepticism comes in. Experts like Elaine Kamarck from the Brookings Institution, she's worked on government streamlining before under President Clinton.
Okay.
And she called Musk's proposed cuts ridiculous.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially with all that mandatory spending.
Yeah.
Social Security and all that.
So on the one hand, we have these bold pronouncements about slashing the budget, but then we have serious doubts about if it's actually possible.
Yeah, it's a bit of a contradiction.
Doge seems to be facing an uphill battle right from the start.
For sure. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
But here's something I didn't expect. Doge's ideas are getting some support from some pretty unexpected places.
Really? Who would be on board with this kind of radical overhaul?
Well, believe it or not, Bernie Sanders agrees with Musk.
Bernie Sanders.
Yep, on one key issue, cutting the defense budget.
Well, that's not something you see every day.
I know, right? A self-proclaimed democratic socialist and a billionaire tech CEO, both wanting to shrink the military.
It's an unusual alliance, to say the least.
It is, and the support doesn't end there. Democratic Representative Ro Khanna, he's also been pushing for Pentagon cuts.
Interesting.
And even Congressman Jared Moskowitz, a Democrat, he joined the House Doge caucus.
The what?
It's a group in the House focused on reducing government spending.
So maybe Doge could actually find some bipartisan support after all. That's a twist.
Right. I didn't see that coming either. But let's shift gears for a sec and talk about the people on the ground, the ones actually doing the work. How's Doge recruiting their team?
Oh, it's very Elon Musk. He took to X.
You mean Twitter?
Yeah, well, formerly Twitter.
Right.
To get resumes.
Yeah.
But this is not your typical job posting.
How so?
Musk expects 80-plus hour work weeks from his recruits,
Wow.
focused on unglamorous cost cutting. And here's the real kicker.
What's that?
Zero compensation.
Wait, they want people to work crazy hours? Tackle this super complex task for free?
That's what it looks like.
Who would sign up for that?
That's a great question. It's a fascinating aspect of Doge, the kind of people drawn to this type of challenge.
Yeah.
But before we dive into the human side of things,
Okay.
let's go back to that Grace Commission comparison. There's some important lessons we can learn from that earlier attempt to streamline the government.
Sounds good. Let's do it. So we've got this historical parallel with the Grace Commission.
Yeah.
But you mentioned there were some differences too, right? Besides, the obvious, like the time difference and the whole social media recruitment thing.
Exactly. It's easy to just see them as, similar at first glance. But context really matters. The Grace Commission, led by businessman J. Peter Grace, it came about in a very different political and economic climate than Doge is facing now. They had their own hurdles, and they did achieve some success, don't get me wrong. But the actual implementation of their ideas, it was limited.
You mentioned their report was huge. Like, what kind of things were they actually proposing?
Oh, it was massive, over 1,000 pages, packed with recommendations.
Yeah.
Everything from cutting waste and defense spending to, overhauling the postal service. They said there were hundreds of billions of dollars in potential savings.
Hundreds of billions. That's a lot, even back then. But
Yeah.
if their ideas were so good, why didn't more of them actually happen?
Well, there were a few reasons. Some of the recommendations were just politically unpopular, which is not surprising, really. Others were seen as too complex or just impractical to actually implement. And let's be honest, some were probably just ignored. Big bureaucracies, they have a kind of inertia. It's like steering a giant ship. Changing course takes time and a lot of effort.
So is Doge just setting themselves up to make the same mistakes? Is it all just talk and no action?
Not necessarily. Doge does have some advantages that the Grace Commission didn't. The most obvious one being the direct backing of the president.
Ah, that makes sense.
That gives them a level of authority and influence that the Grace Commission could only dream of.
And don't forget, the personalities involved, Musk and Ramaswamy. They aren't exactly known for being wallflowers. They love making bold statements and grabbing headlines.
True. And that media attention could actually work in their favor. The more Doge is in the public eye, the more pressure there is on the government to take their recommendations seriously. Of course, it could also backfire if things start to go wrong.
Right. High risk, high reward. But let's talk about that elephant in the room. Those proposed $2 trillion in cuts, where could they possibly find those savings?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Musk hasn't given us a detailed plan yet, but we can make some educated guesses. I think it's highly likely that those mandatory spending programs, Social Security, Medicare, they'll be in Doge's crosshairs.
But didn't we say that cutting those programs is basically political suicide? People really rely on them. Any changes are going to be met with a ton of resistance.
That's true. It's a political minefield for sure.
Yeah.
But Musk and Ramaswamy, they might try to frame those cuts as a necessary evil, argue that it's better to make changes now than to let those programs go bankrupt later on. They could say it's the only way to save them in the long run.
I guess that argument could work on some people, but it's still a risky move. What about those agencies Ramaswamy wants to get rid of? The Department of Education, FBI, IRS, those are huge parts of the government. Is that even possible?
It's definitely the most drastic option, and shutting them down completely would be incredibly disruptive, not to mention controversial. But it's worth noting that Ramaswamy has also talked about replacing some of them with smaller, more streamlined versions.
So not necessarily getting rid of them entirely, but more like a radical restructuring, a kind of downsizing and refocusing. Exactly.
It's a lot more nuanced than just, shutting everything down. Whether it's a good idea or not, that's a whole other debate. But it's important to understand the details, see beyond the sound bites and headlines.
Okay, so we have a better idea of what they might target, but there are still a lot of unknowns. Let's switch gears again, talk about the people involved. This whole unpaid volunteers working crazy hours thing. What kind of person signs up for that?
It's a fascinating question, right? What motivates someone to give so much time and energy to something like this, especially when there's no money involved? Musk said he's looking for the top 1% of applicants. But what does that even mean? It's not like a normal job interview.
Right. What are they looking for? Certain skills, a certain mindset.
I think they probably want people with really sharp analytical minds,
Yeah.
a high tolerance for long hours, and they have to really believe in Doge's mission. These are people driven by more than just money. They want to make a difference, leave their mark on the world.
It's like public service, but without the official title or the government salary.
You could say that. It's definitely an unconventional path, but it obviously appeals to certain types of people. People who love challenges, who thrive on pushing boundaries. But it does raise questions about diversity and access. If you have to work for free, who can actually afford to participate?
That's a great point. It does create barriers without meaning to. But let's say Doge figures all that out, and they come up with a set of recommendations. What happens then? They have that July 4th, 2026 deadline. What happens to their work after that?
That's the big question. And Musk and Ramaswamy haven't really talked about it publicly.
Yeah.
I think their hope is that Doge's work will be so impactful, so undeniably beneficial, that whoever the next president is, they'll have to continue what they started.
But what if that doesn't happen? What if the next president just says, thanks, but no thanks. We're going back to the old way of doing things. All that work, all that effort, it could just disappear.
It's definitely a possibility. It's one of the biggest risks with this whole thing. They're trying to build a legacy in a very short amount of time, and there's no guarantee it'll last beyond their time in office.
So it's a gamble. A political experiment with potentially big rewards, but also a very real chance of failing.
That's a good way to put it. And in the end, it's up to each person to decide if they think Doge's approach is worth the risk. Do the potential benefits outweigh the potential downsides? It's a complex question with no easy answers.
We've really been breaking down Doge, looking at its goals, how they're going about it, the people involved.
Yeah.
But let's zoom out for a minute and think bigger picture.
Okay.
What could the consequences of all this actually be for the government, for everyone really? What could a Doge success or failure look like?
That's the question, isn't it? Beyond the headlines and the personalities.
Yeah.
What's really at stake? We talked about Doge's ambition, the pushback they're getting, that whole unconventional approach. But the impact could be how this changes the role of government in America.
So let's start with the good stuff. If Doge does everything they want, what's the best case scenario? Like, paint me a picture of a Doge transformed America.
Okay, well, in theory, a more streamlined, efficient government could have some real benefits. Lower taxes, less red tape, a faster system that actually responds to people. Imagine getting a permit without jumping through a million hoops, or government services that actually work for the people they're supposed to help.
That sounds amazing. But let's be real. How likely is that perfect picture? And are there any downsides we should be thinking about?
Of course. There's a reason why government bureaucracy exists. It's often there to prevent corruption and stop people from abusing their power. Streamlining is one thing, but getting rid of those checks and balances is something else entirely. Finding that sweet spot between efficiency and accountability, that's going to be key.
It's a balancing act. Too much streamlining, and you could end up with a government that's too weak, too easily influenced to really serve its citizens.
Exactly. And that leads us to the potential downsides of this whole experiment.
Yeah.
If Doge isn't careful, their cuts could backfire. We could see weaker regulations that hurt people or the environment, or cuts to important social programs that leave vulnerable people with nothing to fall back on.
And there's that whole issue of transparency and accountability. We're talking about a group of people not elected by anyone with direct access to the president, making decisions that could affect all of us. That's a lot of power for a very small group.
It is. And it highlights how important oversight and checks and balances are. If Doge is going to have this much power, there needs to be a way to hold them accountable, to make sure their decision-making is transparent.
And thinking long-term, we talk about Doge having an expiration date, but what happens to their work after July 4th, 2026? Will their changes actually last? Or will it be back to square one once they're gone?
Nobody knows for sure. Ideally, their reforms would be so successful, so ingrained in the system, that they just keep going, no matter who's in charge. But it's also possible that a future administration could undo everything, or that their work could create problems we don't even see yet.
So it's a gamble, a leap of faith. But isn't that always true when you're trying to make big changes? There are risks, but also the possibility of something great.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why these conversations are so important. We have to weigh the potential benefits against the risks and demand transparency and accountability from the people in power.
So where do we go from here? What does all this mean for our listeners? Doge is a bold experiment. It's a fascinating and controversial attempt to shake things up. It could lead to a more efficient, effective government, or it could completely backfire. We just can't say for sure.
I think the biggest takeaway is that the future isn't set in stone. It's shaped by the choices we make, the questions we ask, the actions we take, Doge reminds us that we, the people, have a role to play in how our government works. Staying informed, thinking critically, making our voices heard. Those are the tools we have to make sure our government actually serves us.
That's a great point, Doge, is making us talk about what we want our government to be in the 21st century. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking those questions, keep learning, and as always, stay curious.